Some decisions are made in silence, with no witness but the land itself. Some acts of kindness cost a man everything he owns before giving him a future he never imagined. And some lives are forever changed, the moment one weary step follows another into the dark. The cowboy never believed a single choice could bend the path of his entire life. Yet that truth began to take shape the moment he walked beside his horse with the Apache girl, slumped weakly across its back. As his boots pressed into the cooling dust and the last light of day faded behind the hills, a quiet certainty settled into him, slow and steady. Fate, he had learned, rarely waited for understanding. It demanded action long before a man could measure the price. He had found her just before dusk, collapsed near a dry creek bed that hadn't seen water in months. Her clothes were torn, stained with dirt and blood, and her breathing came uneven, as if each breath had to be argued for. Nearby lay her horse, motionless, an arrow buried deep in its flank. The shaft snapped under the weight of its fall. The scene told its own story. Violence had passed through here, and it had not been merciful. The cowboy lived alone, far from towns and voices, owning little more than the land he worked with his hands and the single horse that had carried him. Through every hard season, still he did not hesitate. Like a brother responding to instinct rather than thought, he knelt beside her, slid an arm beneath her shoulders, and lifted her carefully, as though roughness itself might finish what the attackers had started. He placed her gently on his horse's back, secured her as best he could, and turned towards safer ground without looking back. Before drifting into unconsciousness, the girl whispered one word, so faint it almost vanished into the wind. "Nalin." He repeated it silently as he walked, holding on to it as if the name itself knew where they were going. The night stretched long and unforgiving as they crossed the valley. His legs burned, his shoulders tightened, and the horse moved with deliberate care, sensing the fragile life it carried. Questions chased each other through his mind. Who had done this to her? Why had she been alone? Would someone come searching, and if they did, what would they see when they found him? Yet one truth remained solid beneath every doubt. Returning her was the only choice a decent man could make, even if it meant giving up the last thing he truly owned. As the land shifted and the air grew tense, he knew they were nearing Apache territory. He had no promise of safety here. Many men avoided this land altogether, feeding their fear with stories they barely understood. But he had always believed fear thrived where understanding had never been offered. So he kept his pace steady, his posture open, showing he carried no threat. At the first pale hints of dawn, the silence shattered. Brush moved along the edges of the trail, and warriors emerged from different angles, bows drawn, faces marked by suspicion and restrained grief. The cowboy stopped and slowly raised his hand, signaling calm. He stepped aside so they could see the girl still breathing faintly atop his horse. Recognition passed through them like a spark. They rushed forward, not with violence, but with urgency and relief. Nalin was not merely one of their own. She was the daughter of their chief. Within moments, the cowboy stood surrounded by a tight circle of emotion too heavy to name. The chief arrived last, his presence commanding stillness. He lifted his daughter carefully, speaking softly in his own language, words that caused the warriors to lower their weapons. Then he turned to the cowboy and asked how she had been found. The cowboy answered plainly. He had seen someone in need and done what any honorable man should. The chief studied him in silence, searching for deception and finding none. His eyes drifted to the horse, dust-covered, trembling with exhaustion, yet still standing after carrying Nalin through the night. He understood at once what had been risked. To his people, a man's horse was not simply an animal. It was survival, livelihood, and companionship. To give it freely to save another's child was an act that echoed louder than any spoken alliance. The warriors stepped back, leaving space between the two men. The chief placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of deep respect, one rarely offered to outsiders. The cowboy nodded in return, not seeking honor, only assurance that Nalin would live. When the healers confirmed she would recover, relief washed over him, followed by uncertainty. His horse was gone, and without it, he had no way to return home quickly, no way to work his ranch, no easy future waiting. Yet regret never came. He believed a man was measured not by what he held on to, but by what he gave up when it mattered most. As the warriors escorted him to a small clearing outside their camp, he felt an unexpected calm. He planned to walk home once the sun rose higher, but morning arrived with the thunder of hooves. He looked up to see the chief approaching on a powerful horse whose coat shone like polished copper. Behind him stretched a line of riders leading stallions and mares of remarkable strength and beauty. The chief dismounted and spoke with solemn clarity, explaining that a man who gave everything deserved far more than he had lost. The cowboy tried to refuse, insisting the girl's life was enough. The chief shook his head. "A single life," he said, "is worth more than all the horses in this land." He stepped aside, revealing 50 thoroughbreds standing in the morning light. One horse would have been generosity. 50 was a vow of eternal respect. The cowboy stood speechless, overwhelmed by a gift that was more than reward. It was trust, forged between two worlds rarely connected by compassion. The chief waited patiently as the weight of the moment settled in. When the cowboy accepted, understanding refusal would dishonor them both. Approval softened the chief's expression. Warriors stepped forward, teaching him the ways of the herd, their signals, their names, and as hours passed, a shared respect grew where distance once lived. Later that day, Nalin awoke and asked to meet the man who had saved her. She thanked him with quiet strength, recalling only fragments of the ambush and the steady hands that carried her. Her voice brought him peace he hadn't known he needed. The chief invited him to a feast that evening, an honor reserved for the brave. Though he felt out of place, he accepted. Stories were shared, songs filled the night, and for the first time in years, the cowboy felt something like belonging. When the celebration ended, the chief told him the horses were now his responsibility, and that he would always be welcome among them as a friend. The next morning, as he prepared to leave, Nalin gave him a braided charm for protection. He rode away with the herd following, glancing back to see them watching from the ridge. The journey home was long, but the horses moved as one. Neighbors later gathered in disbelief, and the cowboy told the story simply, never claiming more than he deserved. Over time, the tale softened old views and opened space for trust. Weeks passed, the ranch flourished, and the cowboy found himself changed. His thoughts often returned to Nalin and the tribe, until one afternoon she appeared on horseback, speaking of partnership and peace. The story that began with one injured girl and one horse was far from over. The days that followed the cowboys returned to his ranch past with a strange mix of familiarity and quiet transformation, as if the land itself recognized that something within him had shifted. Each morning he woke before sunrise, the same habit he had kept for years, yet now the sound that greeted him was no longer the lonely stamp of a single horse in its pen. It was the low thunder of many hooves, the soft snorts and restless movements of 50 powerful animals adjusting to a new home. The sight still felt unreal to him, even as his hands brushed their coats, checked their tack, and guided them into grazing patterns that kept order without force. He approached them not as possessions, but as lives entrusted to his care, mindful of the responsibility the chief had placed upon him. Each horse carried its own temperament, some calm and watchful, others spirited and eager, and he learned quickly that patience earned more obedience than strength ever could. As he worked, neighbors continued to arrive, drawn by curiosity and disbelief. They stood along his fence line or rode closer, eyes wide, voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the miracle before them. They asked how such fortune had come to a man who had always lived so plainly. The cowboy answered the same way every time, telling the story without embellishment, giving credit where it belonged. He spoke of Nalin, of the chief, of honor repaid, not as debt but as principle. Some listeners nodded with admiration, others frowned in quiet confusion, struggling against the old stories they had been raised on. Yet the tale had a way of settling into people, planting doubt where certainty once lived. Over the following weeks, the presence of the herd changed the rhythm of the ranch. Tasks that once took him entire days were now shared among many strong backs. Fields were cleared more efficiently, fences reinforced, and trade opportunities opened where none had existed before. Still, wealth never sat comfortably with him. He continued to live simply, repairing his own tools, cooking his own meals, and rising with the sun. What mattered more than the horses themselves was what they represented: trust. A bridge formed where there had once been distance. In quiet moments, his thoughts drifted back to Apache land, to Narlin's calm voice, to the chief's steady gaze. He wondered how her recovery progressed, whether she still carried pain from the ambush, whether she thought of the stranger who had walked through the night for her sake. He did not allow himself to dwell too long on these thoughts, reminding himself that fate rarely revealed its full design at once. When the afternoon came that she returned, the light was slanting low, casting long shadows across the range. He noticed movement at the edge of the land and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. As the riders drew nearer, recognition followed relief. Narlin rode at the front, her posture confident, her movements steady, accompanied by two warriors who kept respectful distance. She greeted him with a warmth that carried both gratitude and purpose, explaining that her father wished to speak with him about something important. The chief, she said, believed the time had come for more than gratitude. He envisioned a partnership between their people, one built on shared trade routes, mutual protection, and respect for land neither side could afford to lose. The herd, she explained, was not the end of the gift, but the beginning of cooperation. The cowboy listened without interruption, weighing each word carefully. He understood what was being offered was not just opportunity, but responsibility on a scale he had never carried before. He agreed to travel with them back to Apache territory to speak directly with the chief. The journey felt different this time. Where once he had walked into their land with uncertainty and risk, he now rode with open welcome. The warriors moved with ease beside him, conversation light but respectful, and when they reached the camp, there was no tension in the air, only recognition. The chief greeted him not as an outsider, but as a man whose actions had already spoken louder than words. They spoke at length, sitting near the fire as the sky darkened. The chief explained that conflict had cost both sides more than they could measure, and that survival in the years ahead would require cooperation rather than suspicion. The cowboy answered honestly, acknowledging his lack of political ambition, but affirming his belief that peace built on mutual respect was worth any effort. They agreed to begin with shared grazing boundaries and trade, allowing trust to grow slowly, rooted in action rather than promises. That night, as they shared a meal, the cowboy felt again that unfamiliar sense of belonging. He listened to stories from elders, learned the meanings behind traditions, and understood more clearly why the chief had responded as he had. Honor, he realized, was not something claimed. It was something proven again and again, through choices made when no one was watching. When he returned to his ranch days later, the partnership began to take shape. Apache riders escorted trade caravans safely through disputed land, while the cowboy ensured fair exchange and open communication with nearby settlements. Skepticism did not vanish overnight, but steady cooperation had a way of quieting fear. Narlin visited often, sometimes to carry messages, sometimes simply to check on the horses that had once been hers in spirit, if not in name. Their conversations grew easier, deeper, touching on loss, responsibility, and the strange ways life crossed paths that seemed never meant to meet. The cowboy found himself listening more than speaking, learning to see the land not as something to be claimed, but as something shared. Seasons shifted, and with them came challenges. Drought threatened grazing lands, and tensions flared when resources grew scarce. Yet the agreements held. When disputes arose, they were met with discussion rather than violence. The cowboy saw firsthand how fragile peace could be, and how much effort it required to maintain. He also saw how powerful it became once people chose to protect it together. Through it all, Narlin remained a steady presence, her recovery complete, her strength evident in every decision she made. She carried herself with the confidence of someone shaped by hardship and guided by purpose. The cowboy never spoke openly of his growing respect for her, nor did she name the connection that formed quietly between them. It existed in shared glances, in understanding pauses, in the knowledge that both had been changed by a single night long ago. As months passed, word of the partnership spread, softening hardened views on both sides. Trade increased, conflicts diminished, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier. The cowboy often reflected on how close he had come to walking past that creek bed, to choosing safety over action. He understood now that the greatest turning points rarely announced themselves. They arrived disguised as inconvenience, risk, or loss, and only later did they reveal their true worth. One evening, as he stood watching the sun dip below the horizon, the herd grazing peacefully behind him, he felt a quiet gratitude settle into his bones. His life was no longer defined by solitude nor by wealth, but by connection. The bridge he had unknowingly built continued to hold, carrying more than trade and protection. It carried trust, fragile yet growing, shaped by choices made when fear had been set aside. And though he did not yet know where the path would lead, he sensed with certainty that the story unfolding around him was far from its end. Time moved forward not in leaps but in deliberate steps, each one carrying the weight of choices already made. The partnership between the cowboy and the Apache people did not reshape the land overnight, nor did it erase generations of mistrust with a single agreement. But it endured, and endurance proved to be its greatest strength. Seasons turned, dust gave way to rain, and rain returned again to dust. Yet the bridge that had been formed held firm. Trade routes once feared became paths of shared passage. Riders crossed borders not with hands on weapons, but with nods of recognition. Where silence had once been thick with suspicion, conversation slowly took its place. The cowboy found himself no longer standing alone at the edge of his land. He was part of something larger, something that asked more of him than survival, and in return gave him purpose. He worked harder than ever, not driven by fear of loss, but by commitment. Each decision he made now echoed outward, affecting more lives than his own, and he learned to carry that responsibility with humility. Nalin remained at the center of that change, though she never claimed credit for it. She rode between worlds with ease, respected by her people and welcomed on his land without question. Their conversations deepened over time, shaped by honesty rather than urgency. They spoke of the night she fell, of the moment he chose to stop, and of how close everything had come to ending before it ever truly began. She admitted that for a long time, she had wondered why she survived when so many did not. He told her that sometimes survival was not an answer, but an invitation to do something meaningful with the life that remained. The understanding between them grew quietly, never forced, never named, yet unmistakable in its presence. The chief watched these changes with the patience of a man who understood time better than most. He saw his daughter strong and steady, saw the cowboy remain true to his word, even when no one would have blamed him for stepping away, and he knew the risk he had taken in trusting an outsider had been worth it. As years passed, cooperation replaced conflict along the borders. When drought threatened, resources were shared. When danger arose, warnings were given freely. The old stories did not disappear, but new ones were added beside them, stories of restraint, of help, offered instead of harm. The cowboy often reflected on how easily the story could have ended differently. He imagined the path where he had ridden past the creek bed, where fear or exhaustion had whispered that it was not his problem. In that version of the world, his ranch would have remained small, his nights quiet and empty, his life narrow but predictable. Instead, he stood now on land alive with movement and meaning, surrounded by horses whose strength reminded him daily of the gift he had been given, not just in number but in trust. One evening, as the sky burned orange and gold, Nalin rode out alone to meet him at the far edge of the range. They stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the herd settle as night approached. She spoke first, telling him her father was growing older, that leadership would soon pass to a new generation, one shaped not by endless conflict, but by cooperation learned through lived experience. She asked him if he would remain, not just as a partner, but as a constant presence in the future they were building. He did not answer immediately. He looked across the land, at the fences strengthened by many hands, at the trails worn smooth by shared use, and finally at her. He told her that long ago he had given up his only horse without knowing why it felt right, only that it did. Everything that followed had grown from that moment. If the future required the same courage, the same willingness to choose connection over fear, then he was already committed. Nalin smiled, then not broadly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had found an answer she already believed in. The years that followed did not belong to legend alone. They belonged to work, to compromise, to loss and renewal, to mistakes corrected and promises kept. The cowboy never claimed to be a hero, and the Apache people never treated him as one. He was something rarer. He was trusted. When the chief eventually passed, honored by both his people and those beyond their lands, the cowboy stood among them, not as an outsider, but as a witness to a life that had valued honor above fear. Nalin stepped into leadership with calm authority, carrying forward the balance her father had helped create. Together, they ensured the bridge did not weaken with time. The story of the night walk through the valley was told often, sometimes around fires, sometimes in passing, sometimes softened by retelling, but always anchored in the same truth. A man had seen someone in need and chosen to act, not for reward, not for recognition, simply because it was right. And that choice had redirected the course of many lives, weaving two worlds together where once there had only been distance. On quiet nights, when the land rested and the stars stretched endlessly overhead, the cowboy would sometimes touch the small braided charm still tied to his saddle horn. It reminded him that destiny rarely announced itself with thunder. More often, it arrived quietly, asking only whether a man would stop, lift someone up and walk forward into the unknown. And he knew, with a peace that had taken a lifetime to earn, that he would make the same choice again.